An honor and delight to be here with Rabbi David Ellenson, the Chancellor Emeritus of HUC, the profound scholar and prolific author, and someone that so many of us, myself certainly included, admire very deeply. So thank you for taking time to talk.
It's my pleasure to be here with you.
I also want to take the opportunity to share the exciting news that, along with Professor Michael Marmer, the book coming out this June, American Jewish Thought Since 1934, will be released, profiling, 80 different
American Jewish thinkers. It will transform the intellectual life of American Jewry, not to mention its religious commitments.
Amazing.
Brandeis Press.
So Brandeis Press, very exciting. And I was just a part of a session for over an hour, looking at the names and issues involved, incredibly broad. So I want to look back at your experience growing up as a Jew growing up in the South. And how did your family get to Newport News, Virginia? And what were issues of race that you saw or grappled with as a child? What was it like growing up as a Jew, and not only a Jew, in an Orthodox home in the South?
So there are a lot of questions there. My paternal grandparents came over from Lithuania at the very beginning of the 20th century, probably about 1910 or 11, and ended up in Newport News, Virginia. I am not quite sure precisely how that happened. Family legend has it that my grandfather landed in Baltimore with two brothers. One brother went to Buffalo, one brother stayed in Baltimore, and another, meaning my grandfather, came to Newport News. He'd been a tinsmith in Russia, and he knew there was a large shipyard in Newport News, so he came down there and ultimately started a roofing business, sheet metal works. The interesting part is that there must have been about 70 to 100 Eastern European Jewish families who ended up in the peninsula in Virginia. Newport News probably had about 25,000 people then. And one of the interesting elements of the world that they entered at that point was there was no Reform congregation there. In general, the pattern in American Jewish history in the South is that German immigrants settled and they created Reform congregations. Here you had about 70 Eastern European Jewish families, and they created an Orthodox shul. My father had graduated from college at William and Mary in the early 40s, and after World War II, he went up to Cambridge, Mass., where he went to Harvard Law School, and he met my mother there at a Friday night Hillel service. An interesting story about the southern dimension of this was that my grandmother in Boston, would not initially permit the engagement, saying that she had never heard of a Jew from Virginia, and that until he met my father's mother, she wasn't going to allow the engagement. My mother at the time said, well, how could he not be Jewish? I met him at Hillel, he speaks Yiddish, his name is Sam, he knows how to daven, etc. How could he possibly not be Jewish? And my Bubby Stern, my mother's mother, said, doesn't mean anything according to family legend. The boys at Harvard are very smart. He may just want a Jewish girl. Until I meet his mother, there's no engagement. And at that point, it took 18 hours on the train to go from the peninsula in Tadwater, Virginia, up to Boston. My grandmother, Ellenson, Bubby Ellenson, disembarked. My other grandmother takes a look at her and says to my mother, is this Sam's mother? And said, well, must be Sam's mother. They're kissing, they're speaking Yiddish, they're hugging. And then my Bubby Stern said, okay, the wedding's on. So we came back. I was actually born in Brookline during my dad's last year at Harvard Law, so I was 6 months old when I came back to Newport News. My brother and sister, though, were born there. By the time I grew up, the peninsula in Virginia, meaning Newport News and Hampton, probably had an overarching population of about 200,000. And there were probably about 600 to 700 Jewish families. There were 4 synagogues. One was Orthodox with a mechitza. One was Orthodox with a YU rabbi. but at that point they had mixed seating. Then there was a conservative shul, Roto Sholem, and then there was a Reform temple. Though the Reform temple I don't think began till I was 9 or 10 years old. So that my life was mainly centered around the shul I grew up in, which was the Orthodox shul with a mechitza. Most of our rabbis were from Yeshiva University, but some came from Ner Yisrael in Baltimore. Probably a major turning point when I was about to enter the 7th grade. My father wanted to send me up to the Talmudic Academy in Baltimore. And my mother had no religious objection to it, but she just did not want me to leave home at that point. So instead of going to TA for high school, I remember Rabbi Bullman coming over and trying to persuade my father and mother to send me to TA. And my mother just said no, not because she objected to the Orthodox part. She just wanted me at home till I finished high school. Who knows, I might be living on the West Bank in Yehuda V'Shomron today. But the shul was a major part of my life. But having said that, all the Jews in the community knew one another. My mother was very active in the Federation world. She was a vice president of Hadassah, active in the National Council for Jewish Women. I mean, another anecdote, I'm a little embarrassed to tell this anecdote. When I first came to Virginia, my mother tells a story. She was a 22-year-old, as she put it, girl coming from Boston. And my grandmother, Bubby Ellenson, shows up at the house with an African-American woman. And my grandmother says to my mother, Rutzi, Roz, in Yiddish, this is Ora. She's going to be working for you. And my mother said, what do you mean she's going to be working for me? Well, she's going to cook the meals every night for Sam and you. She's going to take care of David. And my mother said, well, what am I supposed to do? And she said, well, on Monday, the girls go to the Ladies' Auxiliary at the shul. On Tuesday, you go to the National Council for Jewish Women. On Wednesday, you have Hadassah. There was a whole Southern Jewish life that clearly was quite rich, but it was also a way that I was introduced into race, so that I had an African-American woman who really took care of me, along with my mother, from the time that I was little. Segregation was just a way of life. We were all aware that there were large numbers of African Americans, but the world I lived in at that point, except for the shul, which was an integral part of my life. I mean, I would go there virtually every single day to study Hebrew after school. But in addition, I'd be there every Shabbos, Friday night, Saturday morning, Sunday, we had additional education. So there would be 5 days a week for about 2 hours a day we'd be studying Hebrew. The primary focus of the education was on tefillot. I call it Jewish civic education. The idea was, how would you become a competent Jew who could participate in the life of the shul? My father was a president of the shul. So I learned I learned all kinds of nusach from the time I was little, and to this day, I probably could recite virtually any non-high holiday prayer in the traditional Ashkenazic rite with appropriate nusach, and maybe a lot of even the high holiday nusach. It was just an integral part of who I was. My name's Miros. I'd get up and lead that at the end of services, so that it was a very intensely Jewish world. Israel was at the very center. My parents were extremely strong Zionists. I was born on November 21st, 1947, and my mother used to always say, you entered the covenant of the Jewish people with your bris on Kaftet November, which was, of course, the day that the state of Israel was, or the partition plan was voted into by the United Nations. So there was this very active Jewish life. On the other hand, we were always aware of there being non-Jews, aware. The whole world was non-Jewish. My family participated in the civic life of Newport News. One of my uncles, there were 5 Ellenson brothers and sisters. We all lived on the same street for a long time, Oak Avenue. One uncle was director of public works for the city of Newport News. For a Jew to have a public position was very unusual in those days. Mm-hmm. And my father and uncle were both attorneys. Another brother took over my grandfather's roofing business. I was a page boy in the Virginia State Senate in 1962. And again in 1964, I was a page to the Democratic delegation at the Democratic National Convention. So there was this bifurcated world. On the other hand, the world was completely segregated. I have vivid memories of there being colored and white signs. Mm-hmm. One funny story, when I was 6 or 7, I went with a friend of mine to the public library in Newport News. We were brought by his older sister. And for whatever reason, African Americans and whites could enter the public library. It wasn't segregated in that way, but there were separate water fountains mm-hmm. for blacks and whites. They called them colored in those days. Mm-hmm. And I'll never forget my friend David Rosenwasser goes over to the water fountain, and he was maybe 6 or 7, and he starts to drink some water, and he turned to his sister and said, "I don't understand." And my friend's sister said, "What do you mean you don't understand?" He said, "Well, the water doesn't look colored to me." But it just says what the nature of the world was that we lived in. And when I was a boy, 11, 12, 13, I have vivid memories of students from Hampton Institute, now Hampton University, fighting for desegregation of public facilities in Newport News. At one point, the stores tried to handle the segregation or desegregation, integration, by just removing all the seats in places like Grants and Woolworths. But that solution didn't seem to work very well, because then nobody could sit, African Americans or whites. But I was very mindful. Jews were part of the white community. And on a personal level, I felt like I was really part of Virginia. And on the other hand, as a Jew, I knew that part of me never was. And I think a lot of the social justice commitments that I've had in my entire life emerged from that period and the unfairness. One last story I tell. I remember once my father took me to a segregationist rally. This was at a time in Virginia where, you may or may not be aware, there was a period where several counties, including Prince Edward in Virginia, closed their public schools rather than allow integration. This was several years after Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. Virginia was maybe the only place in the English-speaking world that had the ignominious distinction of having no public school system in some of its counties. That was how much people fought to retain segregation. My father said, "I want you to come with me," and we drove. It was about 2 hours out into the country, and my father's only comment was, when we got there, he said, "I want you to see what evil is." And I listened, and we went home, and he didn't say another word, but it left a tremendous impress upon me listening to these white supremacist speeches.
Wow. So it sounds like those years were incredibly formative of your Jewish identity, of your social justice commitments, of just your sense of your own American identity, and your own ethical sensibilities.
The interesting part is being there. On one level, I've always thought Northern Jews have images of there being Ku Klux Klanners in their regalia discriminating against us. But that wasn't the case. But on the other hand, there was always a sense, from my point of view, of dis-ease. Now, having said that, many of my friends were non-Jewish. I was president of the student body at Newport News High School, which was overwhelmingly 98% non-Jewish. But I always felt I was different. The idea that the Jewish people were an embodade, that we were alone or segregated, from the rest of the world was really an integral part of who I was as a Jew. And at the same time, I had a tremendous commitment to Klal Yisrael. I was also very active in both NCSY, the National Conference of Synagogue Youth, and AZA, which is Aleph Tzaddik Aleph, which was today part of BBYO, the B'nai B'rith Youth Organization. We had one rabbi at the shul who was not happy about my joining AZA, that he was much more of a separationist. He thought NCSY should be enough. And my parents absolutely opposed that kind of position. I mean, was always part of the larger Jewish community. And in fact, it was also a world where every Jew I knew belonged to one or two synagogues, where you gave a contribution every year to the United Jewish Appeal. In my home, there was an incredibly strong sense of not only commitment to traditional Judaism, but as I said before, to the State of Israel and to Jewish peoplehood, Klal Yisrael. They were integral parts of how I grew up.
So how did you get to a place where such a bulk of your scholarship on modern Jewish thought was about Orthodox thinkers? I mean, obviously you had that Orthodox upbringing, but what was it that sparked that interest and commitment for you?
Well,
people like Hildesheimer.
Yeah, it's a great question. Well, part of it was that I did grow up in a very Orthodox background. I used to study text with our rabbis quite often. I went to college at William and Mary, which is not a major center of producing, lots of thinkers in Jewish thought, though perhaps more than you might think. John Stewart went to William and Mary.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. He once gave me a copy of a book. My daughter Ruthie knew someone who worked for him, and he sent me a copy of a book he had written called, I think, America. It's sort of a parody of a 8th grade middle school civics book, and he signed it to me. I still have it. It was to Rabbi Ellenson. If there had been 8 more of us at William and Mary, we would have made a binyan. Which wasn't quite true. And then my senior year in college, I got very interested in one course I took. It was a course taught by a man named James Livingston, who was an expert on Protestant and Christian thought. And I took a course in contemporary Christian thought. And I read Kierkegaard, we read Nietzsche, we read Tillich, Desjardins, and we did read Buber. He was the one Jew in the class. But I found it the most compelling thing I'd ever read. Kierkegaard's diaries overwhelmed me. I hadn't yet really read people like Rabbi Soloveitchik or Rabbi Heschel. And I thought, well, this is something I want to know more about. Though the year I graduated college in '69, I joined like a state teacher corps in Newport News. The state of Virginia created a program where students who were college graduates but without preparation and education would teach in predominantly African American schools. So I taught special education for a time in Dunbar Elementary School, which had maybe 1,500 African American students. And it was during that period, though, that I decided, rather than become an attorney like my father or uncle, that I just wanted to know more about what religion would say. So I ended up going to the University of Virginia, which had just created a master's program in religion. Ironically, Dr. Livingston said, have you thought about becoming a rabbi? Well, the only rabbis I really was close to were these Orthodox rabbis, and I said, no, I'd never become a rabbi. So I went to UVA, and I had a professor, David Little, who taught Sociology of Religion, which had a tremendous impact on me. Suddenly I was being introduced to people like Durkheim, Weber, and Marx, and I began to think about, well, how does religion develop and change? And I had a professor, Rabbi Alan Lutovsky, he changed my whole life. He was the first Jew I met who was a graduate of JTS, who was religiously committed, but also very, very much part of the larger world. And he and his wife, Jean, embraced me. And ultimately, after a year in Israel, I decided to go to rabbinical school. So I decided to go to HUC, principally because I wasn't halachic anymore. And in those days, that was about the only choice left. Though the irony is I knew nothing almost about the Reform movement when I entered. And while I was at HUC, I went to Columbia, so I was interested in the question of how does traditional religion respond to change. And I think in my head, and I still do, I have conversations with many of my Orthodox teachers, rabbis from the time I was a boy. And I came to focus on Rabbi Hildesheimer, who was the head of the Orthodox seminary in Berlin, really one of the first Orthodox rabbis in the modern world to also receive a PhD from a German university. In fact, he received his doctorate at Halle, the city where there was the terrible anti-Semitic attack this past Yom Kippur.
Really? Oh, yeah.
So he received a doctorate on the Septuagint in the 1840s in Halle. And I was in the library at Columbia in the reading room, and ironically, I discovered I was reading a rabbinic thesis from an HUC student named Jonathan Brown, who had written a work on Rabbi W. Tzvi Hoffman, who later became head of the Hildesheimer Seminary. I had never heard of Hildesheimer, but I saw, here you have an Orthodox rabbi who wrote lots of tshuvot, wrote lots of articles. So I was interested in the question of how does a traditional religion respond to change, and that is really what led me to write about orthodoxy. I also love the Hebrew language, and I love rabbinic texts. A story that I've told on other occasions, when I was a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, I was studying the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, and the first bracha, the Avot, and as you know, it says Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And I was maybe 7, and I asked our teacher, Rabbi Bowman, I said, well, why weren't, and I could not have used the term Chazal at that point, but I asked, why isn't this line consistent? And the rabbi said, what do you mean? And I'm sure I didn't use the word like consistent then either. Right. But the rabbi said, what are you asking? I said, well, they use Abraham's second name instead of Avram. They say Abraham. And if they use Abraham, why don't they say instead of Yaakov, Yisrael? Like, why not either use both first names or both second names? And I'll never forget Rabbi Bowman came over and he gave me a kiss. And from that day on, I loved studying Jewish texts. The answer he gave was that Avram wasn't Jewish. And when he became Jewish, after his circumcision, he became Avraham. But Yaakov was born a Jew. Who knows? There are probably 1,000 midrashim on that.
But those formative moments are so powerful.
But I remember the story very vividly. So for me, what's interesting, and I like responsa literature the best because they represent for me a crossroads where past and present meet in the ongoing history of the Jewish people. In other words, you have the past, you have principles, rules, text from the Jewish past, and the question is, how do you apply it today? What should Jews think about immigration policy? What does our tradition tell us about this? And then a rabbi has to make a decision at a particular moment. I conceptualize Judaism as an ongoing serial novel where you're the heirs to what's been written before, but on the other hand, you have a responsibility to write whatever the current chapter is as you try to lead people both in the present and towards the future. And so I've always liked studying particularly the German rabbis because these were rabbis who participated fully in the modern Western world. They received PhDs from German universities. They had secular educations, but they were completely committed to a thick traditional Jewish culture. So the questions of how would they respond to pluralism, how did they respond to how do you educate people appropriately, how do you respond to these kinds of issues in the modern world? That's what really compels me as I engage in my studies. And I didn't mention him, but the other professor who had a tremendous impact on me was Jacob Katz of Hebrew University. He was a visiting professor at Columbia. And
he wrote Shabbos Goy?
Yes, yes, and tradition and
tradition and modernity or something.
tradition and culture, out of the ghetto.
I've read a few.
And so he became my teacher. I even translated an article of his while I was his graduate student. Kavim lebiografia lidmuto shel Chatam Sofer. Notes towards a biography of the Chatam Sofer. It was published later in English. So Professor Katz demonstrated to me how responsive texts were ideal for studying the ongoing story of the Jewish people. And so for me, these texts are part of that story.
So it's so fascinating. One last question for you, I think. Does the Reform movement have a theology? So like when you've looked at Orthodoxy, I mean, it's not so difficult to iron out Orthodoxy has a lot of diversity, but theology is relatively clear.
Yes.
And the boundaries are pretty well policed. And I wonder, like, is there a coherent theology within the Reform movement? And I guess maybe a connected question. I know it was long debated, should the Reform movement embrace some kind of halachic discourse, even if it's going to be a progressive,
right.
But in this notion of a responsa, this notion of actually doing that intellectual work to connect past and future, would you be a proponent for sort of a Reform revival of such?
So I would say, you're quite correct. Orthodox Judaism does not have the problem with authority that Reform Judaism has. In other words, Orthodox Judaism, and I don't need to tell you, however you define it, however broadly, and there are radically different ways Orthodox Jewish thinkers characterize this, does affirm a notion of Torah min hashamayim. There is a sense in which the Torah, meaning written and oral law, Torah shebichtav v'gam Torah sheba'al peh, are holy. In other words, if I used philosophical language, the epistemological authority of the tradition is clear. What happens if you don't accept that epistemological authority and don't have this view of revelation? And that's really the question. So the reality is Reform Judaism does believe, and here I'll quote Mordechai Kaplan, but other thinkers have done this as well, that Judaism really is an evolving civilization. Judaism is not only in history, but it's of history. And the idea that you have a contentful revelation at Sinai is problematic. In other words, most Reform rabbis affirm a version of the thought, I think either of Martin Buber or Rosenzweig, that you have, in quotes, a contentless revelation where God and Israel meet at Sinai, but the covenant is forged through the meeting itself, not through the mitzvot that are given. Now, of course, every Orthodox rabbi I study finds that proposition heretical. I mean, I could use other terms. Wrong would be another way to put it. But what happens if that's where you stand? So the question comes to be then, how is it that I view the response, or how does the Reform movement?
Meaning there is a God, there is revelation, and that's an ongoing revelation.
But it's an ongoing, by the way, as a result.
Not a commanding one necessarily.
But not necessarily a commanding one. That's why when I read people like Brad Artson or Tamar Ross even, with their notion of cumulative revelation, she probably wouldn't agree with my depiction of her views, but I understand that a bit better. What I see the halachic tradition as being is it's an integral part of our tradition. There are problems with it. It's written principally by men. I mean, I don't even need to go through all the critiques. A lot of the morality I applaud, and some of it, mamzerut, I could go on and on. I find problematic the whole secondary status, in my opinion, that women are accorded in halakha represents tremendously problematic parts of the tradition for me. I understand that in a patriarchal culture these things emerge, but it doesn't command me in any way. In that sense, I am Reformed. There's no question about it. But Jews have a right to be part of an ongoing conversation. Consequently, and this is somewhat ironic, there's actually a lot of halakhic literature written by Reform Jews from the very beginning of the Reform movement with the Hamburg Temple, through people like Moshe Zemer, Walter Jacob, Mark Wachowski, Rachel Adler. Today you have Reform Jews writing responsive. The CCAR has a responsa committee. Because what you're doing here again is to engage with the tradition. Now the problem is, what is the epistemological and authoritative status of that tradition? And that is somewhat problematic. So the way I put this is that orthodoxy does not have a problem with authority.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know if I can affirm the foundational belief that the Orthodox have that legitimates that authority.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, what Reform does that is true to me is it talks about the ongoing evolutionary historical nature of the Jewish people that leads to a great degree of pluralism, but authority does remain a problem within Reform. In other words, even when responsa are written, it's hard to know what they mean in an authoritative sense, though to be part of the Jewish conversation, I think it's integral that these sources be heeded.
Okay, so unity would be difficult both normatively and theologically, essentially.
Yes, in the Reform movement.
Right.
See, Reform is good on pluralism.
Yeah.
Hard to know where the boundaries. It's hard to know what the. I must have something going on there. It's hard to know theologically, philosophically, what the grounds can be for boundaries within Reform.
Yeah.
In other words, Reform is good for me because I think it's correct. If I didn't think it was true, I wouldn't have gone to Hebrew Union College.
Right.
But I do recognize there is a problem with authority and orthodoxy. For all the pluralism, look, a lot of my work does demonstrate that there are pluralistic views. Tonight I'm giving a talk for you.
Yeah.
And I'm going to show on issues like conversion, there are multiple paths that an Orthodox rabbi could adopt in relationship to Piskei Din, to rulings on conversion. But what they do agree is that the sources to which you would look have to be these halachic sources, however creatively you might interpret them. And the rulings that you're giving, even when they represent chidushim, novel interpretations, are still seen as being implicit in the original revelation given by God to Moses at Sinai. And I would not assert that.
Beautiful. Well, I've got 100 more things to ask you, but we're out of time. So please, friends, make sure to check out the books, and especially American Jewish Thought since 1934, coming out this year, and wonderful scholarship by Rabbi David Ellenson. Thank you so much.
Thank you.